This is GM Word of the Week, and I'm Fiddleback. Coffee. Here at the Word of the Week, we focus pretty heavily on the words that are likely to come up in your favorite fantasy games and stories, especially in tabletop role-playing games. You know, words meant to help you understand the flavor of the world. We explain the origins of various monsters and magical items, explore the daily life and times of your average medieval personage, talk about the histories of cultures that have informed the fantasy world, and so on. But sometimes we buck that trend a little and talk about words without which fantasy role-playing games and stories would not exist. We've talked about the development of war games as a pastime, for example, and we talked about the history of storytelling itself. But today we're talking about a word without which we can assure you this show would not exist. And that's not all. We're also willing to bet that there would be a lot fewer game designers in the world, and many video games wouldn't exist. And while it might seem like a modern invention, it has connections to some very old kingdoms and empires. In fact, it's connected to what is sometimes recognized as one of the oldest nation-states in the world. We're talking about the stuff that is keeping us awake and alert and literate enough to bang out a script. The stuff that fills our mug every Saturday morning so we can keep bringing this show to you every Tuesday morning. We're talking about something that is part of the daily habit of 100 million Americans. It's basically 1/3 of the population of America. And we're talking about the most consumed, mood-altering drug in the world, according to the World Health Organization. We're talking about coffee. Oh, and since we also have a granola bar sitting next to our cup of coffee, and since that also connects to the history of coffee in one of the oldest kingdoms in the world, we're going to talk about those too. And before you accuse us of running out of ideas and simply writing about the first thing we saw on our desk because we had a deadline, let us assure you that is not the case. First of all, we're ahead of schedule. For the first time in nearly a year, we are one script ahead of our deadlines. Second of all, we're writing about this because it's actually topical. See, as you're listening to this in the first week of March 2019, assuming it's on or around the day of release, there is a very important 5-year anniversary to celebrate. And it has to do with Expo 2015, held in Milan. Now, we've talked before about the history of the expos, world fairs, universal expos, and international expos. Those are all different names for the same things. Basically, what happened was that France wanted to tell the whole world how awesome its industrial revolution was going. So it held a giant industrial exposition in 1844 to brag to Europe and the world about all the neat French things that they were doing. And then other countries got in on the act. England did one bigger and better in 1851 and called it the Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations. That was held in Hyde Park in London. After that, it became a thing to do every few years, with different countries competing to host the event. Over time, different types of expos have emerged from the tradition. They aren't quite annual. Some are specialized, some have themes, some are just general expositional shindigs. But they are all places for the host country and various other countries to show off their latest industrial and technological achievements, as well as showcase their cultures, traditions, and histories. Now, we know you've done the math, and have already figured out that Expo 2015 was only 4 years ago, and it ran from May to October. But we're not talking about the Expo itself. We're talking about the secret meeting that happened a year before the Expo to set up the single most important event of Expo 2015, whose theme was, by the way, feeding the planet energy for life. In early March of 2014, the International Coffee Organization resolved to bring order to the chaos by declaring one official International Coffee Day across the entire world. That day would be October 1st. And the first one would be announced and celebrated with much fanfare at Expo 2015 in Milan. Yes, this is actually a thing that happened. See, many coffee-consuming nations to which various member companies of the International Coffee Organization belonged already celebrated some form of National Coffee Day. And it was basically a marketing thing. Lots of cafes and chains would offer free cups of coffee on National Coffee Day to get people in the door. And those work because people will also buy danishes and donuts and all sorts of other things that pair well with coffee. But the dates were scattered across the calendar, and the ICO wanted to make it a world marketing thing. One date for the whole planet. Except for America. See, America had its own manufacturing organization, the NCA, the National Coffee Association, and they'd already made a big thing of their own National Coffee Day. And they'd been doing so since 2005. So they weren't about to up and change. So in America, we still celebrate National Coffee Day on September 29th. And according to the folks who track things like social media trends, chain store sales, and all that other stuff, the American Day still gets a significantly bigger amount of play. But that is very slowly changing. Meanwhile, the first country to have any sort of National Coffee Day was Japan. They started theirs back in 1983, and it was on October 1st. And they're a pretty powerful member of the ICO. Now, if it seems like we're making a big thing about international coffee cabals, shifty marketing, and trade deals, you ain't seen nothing yet. Just wait until you hear how coffee ever got to places like Europe, America, and Japan. It's a bumpy ride. But first, let's talk a little about coffee itself. Coffee is, of course, a hot beverage made by soaking ground coffee beans in water. And now, this is the part where we point out, in internet factoid fashion, something that you've definitely already heard, but which we will be lambasted for leaving out. The coffee bean is not technically a bean. Except, here's the thing, it also kind of is. Because the definition of bean is kind of wibbly-wobbly. The word originally came from the Germanic language and was in use around 1000 CE to refer to those little edible thingies that come inside pods that you could eat. Things like peas and favas and stuff. But then, in America, Europeans discovered whole other plants entirely. And they started calling those things beans as well. So the whole thing became very confused. These days, the word bean refers to the edible seeds of any member of the Fabaceae family of plants. That's the family also known as the legume, pea, or bean family. But various agricultural standards exist across the world that define beans more or less broadly. Fun fact, peanuts are actually beans. That said, the coffee bean is a seed. It's the seed of the coffee plant, and it is found inside a bright, red fruit called the coffee cherry. And that name is actually pretty accurate, because the coffee seed is classified as a pit, not a bean. That's because the coffee plant is a drupaceous plant. That is, it produces a drupe, a fleshy fruit that surrounds a pit. And the pit consists of a hardened protective outer layer and a seed at its core. Apricots, cherries, peaches, olives, and plums are all drupes, just like coffee. Fun fact, almonds, cashews, and pistachios are also drupes. You see how confusing this stuff gets. So you pick a bunch of coffee berries off a coffee berry tree, then you throw them all in water and see which ones float and which ones sink. The floaters aren't ripe, so you throw them out. Then you skin the cherries, pulp them, and let them ferment so the coffee beans get infused with fermented coffee cherry goodness. Then you dry them out until they are only about 10% water. Then you clean off the beans to get rid of the remains of the coffee cherry pulp, and then you roast them. As you roast them, the water is driven off, and the flavor is concentrated. This also causes the fibers in the bean to expand, so roasted beans swell and split. That's why they have that characteristic look. The longer you roast them, the bigger and darker they get, and the stronger the flavor gets. That's where you get your dark roasts and light roasts, and of course, espresso. Espresso isn't a special type of coffee, it just derives from roasting the beans longer and longer. Once you're ready to turn the beans into delicious coffee, you grind the beans up. Obviously, you can adjust the flavor by adjusting how finely you grind the coffee. And then you pass near but not quite boiling water through the grounds so it absorbs the flavor. And then you have coffee. Of course, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little about the best part of the coffee. And that's the caffeine. Now, technically, caffeine is a mood-altering drug, and we'll talk about how it works in a second. But we also have to explain that it is not technically addictive. That's because there's a difference between dependence and addiction. But this is also another hairy gray area, like the bean thing. And various medical organizations, including the World Health Organization, keep changing their mind about which is what and where the line is. In fact, the WHO currently classifies caffeine as addictive, even though most other health organizations only call it dependency forming. Basically, the difference comes down to whether the subject's reliance on the substance is physical or whether it is psychological. Or more often, since it's usually both, how much of it is physical and how much is psychological. And we're not going to weigh in on that anymore, because it's such a complex issue fraught with a lot of disagreement and changing definitions. The only thing we'll explain is the idea of physical versus psychological dependence. It's a physical dependence if a substance has changed your body to such a degree that you will experience actual physiological symptoms if you stop consuming the substance. It's psychological if you've come to associate the substance with something else, like dealing with stress, or as part of your morning routine or whatever, such that you can't mentally separate the one from the other. If you mentally feel you can't wake up or deal with a stressful situation without a cup of coffee, that's psychological. If you get headaches and blood pressure rebound from skipping coffee, that's physical. But what is caffeine and what does it do exactly? Well, to understand that, you have to understand adenosine. Adenosine is a byproduct of your nervous system. That is, as your brain and neurons all fire off their messages throughout the day, carrying messages from central command down to your fingers and toes and every which way, your nervous system produces adenosine. You can think of it as a sort of waste product of the process, if that helps. Though that's not totally accurate. Now, your body is constantly monitoring how much adenosine is building up. Basically, there are receptors throughout your nervous system that scoop up the adenosine, and they keep count and report back to central command about adenosine levels. Now, eventually, for a variety of factors, your nervous system needs a break. It needs to refresh itself of other chemicals to keep going. Basically, it tires out. And when that happens, it stops producing adenosine, and the adenosine levels in your body drop. And that signals to your body that it's time for your daily shutdown and refresh. So you start to get drowsy. The night shift comes on duty and starts to wind down the daily operations for sleep time. Now, chemically speaking, caffeine looks a lot like adenosine. See, your body uses all sorts of lock and key mechanisms based on the shapes of various molecules, and caffeine is shaped like adenosine. So the receptors in your body pick up caffeine and think it's adenosine. And so caffeine fools your body into thinking that your nervous system isn't ready for a recharge. And that is why caffeine stimulates you, and why it keeps you from sleeping. Sort of. I mean, your body isn't completely stupid. And when it notices you seem to be producing more of something, it adjusts. So, if you habitually consume the same amount of caffeine every day for a week or two, your body adjusts its adenosine levels to the point where it isn't nearly as easy to fool. That's called building a tolerance. Now, if caffeine had a much stronger effect on the body, a person who had reached that point would be compelled to increase their dose every day to compensate for the tolerance. But caffeine is a pretty minor stimulant as drugs go. And that's why there's the big argument whether to count it as physiologically addictive or not. That said, caffeine does have withdrawal effects. Once your body has gotten used to it, if you suddenly reduce or eliminate its supply of caffeine, all those extra adenosine receptors will suddenly have nothing to guzzle up. And so you'll probably get a headache. You might feel fatigued. If you consumed a lot of caffeine in a day, your blood pressure might fluctuate. You might become depressed or irritable. You can even suffer nausea or vomiting. And after about 7 to 10 days of no caffeine, all those symptoms go away because your body closes down many, but not all, of the extra adenosine receptors it built up to handle the caffeine. But let's put aside the physiological and psychological and biochemical for the last third of this episode and focus on the historical. On the story of two great kingdoms and two great acts of industrial espionage and how coffee has been shaping cultures for 1,000 years. The story begins on the northwestern coast of Africa, just across the Red Sea from the Arabian Peninsula. Starting around 7000 BCE, the people of the region decided that enough was enough with chasing animals around the landscape, and they decided to give this agriculture thing a try. It's the same story you've already heard from us when we've talked about Mesopotamia. It was all the rage at the time. And once that happened, civilization was just popping up all over the Middle East. But the folks in this particular area, the Kingdom of Da'amat, had some pretty neat stuff that their neighbors didn't have. They had ivory, rhinoceros horn, tortoiseshell, and they also had a lot of gold and silver. And thanks to a lot of fighting with neighboring peoples, they had a lot of slaves. So they ended up doing a lot of business with their neighbors in the Middle East. The kingdom was absorbed into another one in around 300 BCE, and that kingdom was called Aksum. And over the course of the next 800 years, Aksum became a pretty powerful trade empire. And as different powers rose and fell to the north, they were happy to do business with all of them. They traded with the Greeks when they came around, then the Romans. Judaism and Christianity spread into the region, and things went well for a while, until their trade routes were cut off, first by invasion from the Persian Empire, and then later in the 7th and 8th century when the Muslim Caliphate conquered pretty much the entire Middle East, and then kept pushing out while also banning all trade through their lands. Then they spread south, resisted the spread of the Islamic faith into their lands, and we're glossing over a lot of history here, we admit. But this is all just backstory, and specifically, it's the backstory of Ethiopia. And because it remains centered on ancient Aksum, Ethiopia can claim the title of one of the oldest still existing kingdoms in the world. What's important for our story, though, was what a shepherd discovered growing near Kaffa. He discovered this red cherry that his sheep absolutely loved to eat. Man, did it ever get them wound up. At least, so the story goes. And this shepherd had apparently discovered the coffee cherry. Now, in truth, the story is probably apocryphal. We know that people in ancient Ethiopia were eating the coffee cherry for a long time. In fact, they used to mash it up into a pulp and squish it into a bar they could carry with them to eat on the go. Yes, they invented the breakfast bar. And they invented the breakfast bar before they invented coffee. We have no idea when they started roasting the beans and grinding and boiling them. Stories seem to suggest it was monks around 1000 CE who did that. There's one story about a monk named Kaldi who did it, but it's all rather vague. We do, however, have a pretty solid record that the first time coffee was actually commercially sold was in a shop called Kiva Han, 1453, in Istanbul. Now, that's probably not too surprising, right? Most people in the know about the history of coffee know that it was big among the Turks, and we mean it was huge. By the 1500s, coffee shops were everywhere in Istanbul and across the Ottoman Empire. They were basically the center of social life there, the equivalent of the British pub. They were the cheers of their day, where everybody knows your name. And we're not overstating this. Bards used to perform in coffee houses. Shadow plays were practically invented in Turkish coffee houses. And some bards would just tell jokes to the crowd. Things like, have you ever noticed the Turks from North Istanbul drive their herds like this, but people from South Istanbul drive their herds like that? And what is up with the food they serve on merchant ships across the Mediterranean? Beyond that, standards for coffee service were written into the laws of the empire at the time. Even their marriage laws mentioned coffee. It was built into their hospitality traditions. Coffee was big. And when the governor of Mecca tried to ban coffee in 1511, it did not go well. He was removed from office, terminally. But here's the thing. The coffee plant grew naturally in Ethiopia, and there's some evidence to suggest it didn't grow anywhere else. So how did it get so big in Istanbul? Well, it appears that Arabian traders smuggled it out of Ethiopia during their Persian conquests. They recognized the plant had real promise, and they started cultivating it heavily. And once they had done that, and coffee had become huge across the Near East and the Middle East, they jealously guarded it. The export of coffee beans and plants was forbidden, under pain of death. And so, the empire basically maintained a giant monopoly on the growing and selling of coffee. It was sacred. So how did it spread beyond the Ottoman Empire? Well, first, traders from a Dutch trading company managed to steal a cutting out of Arabia. And they started heavily cultivating it in their plantations on Java. And it grew so well in Javan soil and in a few other places they had control over that they had their own monopoly on coffee in the West. Which lasted until 1723, when a French trader stole a coffee seedling and shipped it to Martinique. Then, when a Portuguese colonel from Brazil went to help settle a border dispute between French and Dutch colonies in Guyana, he seduced the wife of the governor of the French colony, who smuggled him some coffee seedlings in a bouquet of flowers. And now Brazil was growing coffee too, and by that point, pretty much everyone in every corner of the world could buy coffee. And then, in the 1920s, the American government banned alcohol. And in short order, America was importing 70% of the world coffee supply. And America has basically been consuming roughly 2/3 of the world coffee supply ever since. And that is the story of coffee and beverages, without which there would be no Word of the Week. And I'm sick and tired of talking about coffee because the writer of GM Word of the Week has completely forgotten and ignored the other hot beverage without which there would be no Word of the Week. Because I'm the one who drinks tea. And so next week, we will talk about tea. This has been GM Word of the Week. It's written and researched by The Angry GM and produced by me, Fiddleback. You can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/GM Word of the Week. You can find more at gmwordoftheweek.com and theangrygm.com.